Welcome to Sociology of Race, Ethnicity, and Inequality in the United States. This is Lecture 1. In this lecture, I'm going to lay out some of the basic information that you need to know and basic baseline definitions that we have for race and ethnicity in the United States. In your first discussion post, I asked you to think about race. I asked you 3 specific questions. When was the first time that you remember race existing? Why was this moment or memory significant to you? And what did you learn? Now, the reason I asked you to think about, excuse me, the reason I asked you to think about these 3 questions is because race can be one of 2 things. We often find race can be one of 2 things in this world. One is that it can be something that is an ever present part of your life, meaning that you feel you or your family members or people you know may be singled out based on perceived differences. While for others, it may be innocuous. In other words, things that you've never thought about. In other words, it remained in the background because it wasn't really a salient part of your lives, or at least you were in a life situation, in which it didn't have to play a significant role in your lives. The reason why I asked you to think about why this moment was significant to you and what you learned from it is that in the moment where we first learned that race exists, whether that's based on how a childhood friend was treated, how you were treated, how a family member was treated, oftentimes what we begin to see is that from a very early age that we're socialized that groups of people are different from one another, that some groups are considered superior and others are considered inferior. And in sociology, what we really want to focus on are the ways in which these differences are socially constructed. In other words, that they're attached to power and privilege and difference. In a quick read through of some of your discussion posts, what I immediately realized was that some of you chose to answer this question as the first time you remembered racism existing, which I think is a fundamentally different question. And I want you to make sure that you understand the difference. Is that when I talk about race, we're talking about a large homogenous group of people that we've loosely categorized together and that we've ranked on a hierarchical scale. Racism is acting in a discriminatory manner based on these perceived differences. And so I think it's really important to think through how we've conflated the issue of race and racism. I want to take a moment here to work through some baseline definitions that you're going to need for this class. One is race. Race refers to differences in human physical characteristics used to categorize large numbers of people. It's the differences and similarities between the categories and groups are deemed to be socially significant as a rationale for treating groups differently from one another. As I previously mentioned, what this means is that we take large groups of people and we assume that they're all the same. And it's often assumed that it's based on some form of biology, like skin color. However, I think it's important to note that in sociology, we believe that this is socially constructed. There is no genetic code that says that we should treat people differently, that they're inferior or superior, but in fact, we live in a historical moment. We live through history in which we've created a hierarchy and people are given privileges or not given privileges based on these differences. In other words, it's a classification system that assigns individuals and groups to categories that are then ranked or put into a hierarchical order. And we'll continue to come back to this, but I think it's really important that we understand that race and power are directly correlated with one another. Another important baseline definition that you need to be able to understand is ethnicity. Ethnicity refers to a shared lifestyle informed by cultural, historical, religious, and/or national affiliations. It often involves shared social mores, shared culture, which are the practices, values, and beliefs of a group. And this might also include shared language and traditions, among other commonalities. Now, social mores you may have heard called social norms in your other sociology classes, but essentially when we talk about ethnicity, we are being very, very specific. We are looking at ways in which groups come together because they have these shared beliefs, values, and practices. It's also important to note that members share a distinct awareness of a common cultural identity, separating them from other groups. In virtually all societies, ethnic differences are also associated with variations in power, material wealth, and access to resources. So, based off of these two definitions, I would like you to actually pause the presentation here and maybe even look at your notes and tell me, read through these questions below and tell me what the answers are to each of these questions. You must be able to tell the difference between race and ethnicity. Okay, so hopefully you were able to, based off of the definitions you had in front of you, understand the difference between race and ethnicity. And here are the sort of the quick rundown of the answers that you should have come up with. Asian is a race. In other words, Asian encompasses 42 different separate countries and cultures. Actually, probably more than 42 cultures because there are many different subgroups even within for example, a place like the Philippines or Indonesia. Um, but we assume that all Asians are the same. And so we create a racial category that doesn't delineate. But however, we also make large presumptions and stereotypes about these groups, which we'll get into later in this class. By extension, you should understand that Chinese is an ethnicity. I apologize for the question mark on this slide. Shouldn't be there. But ethnicity, again, it's attached to a very specific group of people with shared values, belief systems, language, culture, and oftentimes religion. And the same explanations also extend to Latino versus Peruvian. And so hopefully you were able to think through why each of these groupings were either race or ethnicity. Now, staying on the topic of race, I think it's important for you to be able to understand that the approach that we are really going to take in this class focuses on the social construction of race. And I'm going to repeat I'm not going to repeat, I will come back to this concept quite a bit in this class. And the Bonilla Silver reading that you're assigned is very much based on this idea. The social construction of race is the central way in which we theorize race in sociology. In other words, how we think about race is understanding that it doesn't have a simple definition. In other words, if you look at the definition of race over time, the meaning has changed. Take, for example, the term white. White, when it first came into being, right, as a category, it was very specific to white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. In other words, those who came from England. This was really a term that came about in the mid 1800s. Some have argued even earlier than that. But what we know is that as we move forward in history, the term white expanded to include a number of other groups. So, for example, when you look at turn of the century, again around 1850 to 1880, white basically included whites. The category of white included those from England, from France, and to some extent Spain, although they've also been categorized as Hispanic in other regions. And that groups like the Irish and the Germans and the Italians were considered non-white. It wasn't until after the 1920s that those groups were included. And as I'll talk about later in this class, that there were very specific reasons why the category of white expanded that had to do with labor and capital and the ways in which these groups needed to include more people in order to have greater access to power. It's also important to note that who has been considered white has also been fought and battled out in our court systems. That we've used, that the meaning of race has changed even in a legalistic sense over time. So again, the sort of core idea that you need to walk away with from this slide is that when we talk about the social construction of race, it's about understanding not only that the meaning of race has changed, but that there are very specific reasons why the meaning has changed and why these categories get continuously redefined in different historical moments. You also need to understand that sociologists argue that race is a social construction and it's not a biological construct. The relative lightness or darkness of one's pigmentation is not what creates the social hierarchy. It is the meanings that we attach to these things. Part of what we talk about in this class is called racialization, which is a process by which understandings of race are used to classify individuals or groups of people. And again, these are all things that I'm going to come back to in multiple different ways. Also, within sociology, I think it's important for you to know that we have different scales of analysis. That oftentimes when we talk about race, we focus on that middle circle, the micro or the individual. And by keeping the discussion solely at the individual level, what ends up happening is that we miss patterns of which groups of people are treated differently. And so part of what sociology focuses on is really those two outer levels, the meso and the macro level. The meso level refers to community or neighborhoods. In other words, you still have these groups of people, but really at a much more familiar level. And the macro level is more global or national. What's happening on a global scale? What's happening at a national scale? So now if we apply that to race and ethnicity, we understand that when we talk about micro, it's about being myself, how it impacts my identity or who I am. When we talk about meso, we're looking at community, recognition, expectations, and interactions. In other words, what's happening here in Sacramento or what's happening in Davis? How does that influence how my race and identity is understood? How does the history of even a place like California change what it means to be a person of color, and how that differs from maybe people in the South? And also at the macro level, there's sort of two different levels at which we talk about race and identity. At the macro level, we look at social categories like Asian or Latino, which I've talked about earlier. We look at classifications, how these classifications or groupings have changed over time historically. But just as importantly, we look at what we call structural inequalities, meaning the types of inequalities that these groups face based on these perceived differences. And at the global level, and as we'll discuss in other parts of this class, we also look at colonization, immigration, and how that impacts the U.S. landscape of race and class. In other words, what we understand is that immigration at a global level has continued to change the shape of race and race relations in the United States. The U.S. Census has traditionally been one of the central ways in which we began to understand race and inequality in the United States. This is a GIS map, a Geographic Information Systems map of the 2010 census by race. What I would invite you to do is to pause this after I finish talking for a second and take a look at this map. This map basically gives a readout of where different groups live. The blue areas represent where whites are living. The green areas, as you'll see, particularly if you look in the bottom right-hand part, represents African Americans. We see that there's a very heavy presence of African Americans, especially in the South. The groups in red represented by red dots are Asians, and you'll see that the Asian groups are heavily located in California, as well as up in the Pacific Northwest near Seattle, as well as over in New York. And you'll see a couple of also groups in the Houston and New Orleans area. And then the U.S. Census uses the category Hispanic. I should note for this class that I make a personal decision to not use the word Hispanic because it is tied to the history of colonization of Spain. And instead, I use the word Latino, but it is your choice as to which you use. That is demarcated in yellow. Not surprisingly, you see a heavy Latino presence particularly in the Southwest. We're starting from the sort of San Diego area all the way through Arizona, Texas, and New Mexico. And then you have other races as well. So this is what the U.S. Census shows us, is the sort of greater distribution of where people are living. The U.S. Census also allows us to move to a much closer level. We could focus in on what sort of demographics look like at a much more localized level. So, for example, this is where we zoom in to the Sacramento area. And so many of you are from Sacramento. In fact, I've lived in Sacramento longer than I have. I just moved up here a year ago. And what this map shows you is the racial distribution of the population of Sacramento County. And what you see is, if we go south, if you look in South Sacramento area, not surprisingly, you have a lot of red dots, which represent the Asian population. We know that South Sacramento is actually a refugee receiving area, that there is a huge Vietnamese population there, and that also, if you were to go into Elk Grove, there's also a very large Filipino population there. So again, um, this should coincide a lot with your own sort of knowledge of Sacramento. Now, if you look just above the title of Sacramento there, that's sort of the central city area of Sacramento, or Midtown. It is relatively diverse, but it does have, it has a large both African American, Latino, Asian, and white population, pretty well balanced. But as you go out into the suburbs, out towards Auburn, Roseville, Citrus Heights, you begin to see that diversity wanes. That, in other words, you see a more homogeneous white population. So my guess is that from your own personal knowledge of this area, that this coincides with your understanding of race in the Sacramento area. Now, I think it's important to note that that these maps matter for more than just giving us a sort of count of the number of people living in the area, or for even just painting a picture of where people are living. Because I think even part of looking at the Sacramento, what happens when we look at a Sacramento map, is that it still looks relatively segregated. Some of that we need to understand as part of a history of what we call restrictive covenants, that we actually, up until about 60 years ago, could write into our property deeds who sellers were allowed to sell to and who weren't. And we'll talk about this a lot in class. These census maps, from a U.S. standpoint and from a state standpoint and a county standpoint, also help us distribute resources based on education, property taxes. It helps us understand where we need to do urban planning, etc. Because in addition to this, that we could also overlay people's socioeconomic status. And what we find, particularly here in Sacramento, is that what we have is a large correlation between minority groups and those who are most likely to be in poverty in our own community. Now, when we look at these census information, and then we realize that policy and procedures are attached to these numbers, this is where we begin to understand why it's important to understand both privilege and hierarchy in the United States. In other words, that if there are some who have greater access to power and privilege, and they can negotiate greater resources for themselves, that what you end up happening is that some groups become disenfranchised and unable to actually have equal access to resources, and that becomes a racialized issue, and that oftentimes gets hidden. And we'll talk about that a lot in this class. Finally, kind of getting back to the study of ethnicity, or why study ethnicity, we have a number of readings that are dedicated to the study of ethnicity. And I think what we need to understand here is, while we oftentimes use the moniker that everybody that we're all Americans, what we forget is that for many communities here in the United States, that they live hyphenated identities, that their culture matters, that what we say is an American culture is oftentimes for other communities kind of hybridized, meaning that they follow some US based social mores and norms, while others will follow the social mores and norms from their home country or from their own culture. So we'll talk about what those different social norms are. We also understand that when we look at the historical experiences of individual groups, that it becomes a lens for understanding and interpreting the world. In other words, that our culture helps us interpret what's going on around us. It also helps us interpret and react to the world around us. It shapes our actions and belief systems. So we're going to stop here for now on this lecture, but this lays out some sort of the baseline types of understandings that you need to have in this class.